A mass grave in Germany, 7,000 years old, 34 bodies, 9 adult men, 16 children, and only 7 adult women, in a farming community that, by any normal count, should have had roughly as many women as men. That gap isn't a rounding error. It's the kind of gap that shows up again and again on prehistoric massacre sites, and once you know how to read it, it tells you something no thrown spear or cracked skull ever could. Some of these raids weren't just about killing, they were about taking people. Here's the actual logic bioarchaeologists use. A living community has a predictable shape, roughly equal numbers of men and women, children in expected proportions. If a massacre killed everyone who was there, the bodies in the grave should roughly mirror that shape. When one specific group, young, reproductive age women, is missing almost entirely, while everyone else is present or even overrepresented, they just weren't home that day, stops being a reasonable explanation. Randomness doesn't selectively erase one age and sex category and leave every other one intact. Deliberate removal does. The clearest version of this pattern comes from a site called Schöneck-Kilianstädten, also in Germany, roughly 7,000 years old. At least 26 bodies dumped together in a trench, men in their 20s and 30s, small children under 8, 1 teenager, 0 young women, 0 children between 9 and 16, old enough to walk, young enough to be raised into a different group. And on many of the skeletons that were there, the shin bones had been deliberately shattered after death or right around it, not a wound from fighting, but a targeted injury that stops someone from running. Researchers who studied the site concluded plainly this population knew how to immobilize people rather than kill them, which makes the missing cohort a lot harder to explain as coincidence. Compare that to a very different site, Halberstadt, also German, also roughly this period, 9 skeletons, 8 men, 1 woman, no children. Bioarchaeologist Christian Meyer's read on this one flips the logic entirely. This isn't a massacred village, it's a raiding party that got wiped out before it could bring anyone home. Same region, same rough era, completely different demographic fingerprint. One site is a settlement stripped of exactly the people worth taking. The other is the attackers themselves, caught with nothing and no one. And there's a third fingerprint, one you already know from an earlier episode. Tolense Valley, Europe's oldest known battlefield, over 130 bodies scattered across a river valley, almost entirely men in their 20s and 30s. No missing cohort, because there was no cohort there to begin with. Nobody came to Tolense looking for captives. They came to fight other fighters. Lay these 3 patterns side by side, and you get a kind of grammar. A settlement missing its young women is a raid for people. An all-male group with nobody else present is the raiding party itself. An all-male group scattered across a battlefield is an army. Bioarchaeologists learn to read these signatures the way a detective reads a crime scene. The oldest version of this pattern we have predates farming entirely. At Nataruk, in Kenya, roughly 10,000 years old, the massacre from our very first episode, one of the 12 best-preserved bodies was a heavily pregnant woman, and the position of her hands suggested to the original research team that her wrists had been bound. Other researchers have since challenged parts of the Nataruk interpretation, whether the burials even happened at the same time. So treat that detail as the original team's reading, not settled fact. But if it holds, it's the same story showing up thousands of years before anyone built a wall or planted a field, killing some people, restraining others. Here's where it gets genuinely difficult, though. Isotope analysis of teeth and bone lets researchers figure out where someone grew up versus where they died, and across multiple Neolithic European cemeteries, a striking number of women turn out to be non-local. At one site, 14 of 16 individuals with came from somewhere else chemical signatures were women. At another, every single one was. On its own, that pattern fits perfectly ordinary marriage practice, women moving to join a husband's community, which many researchers treat as the default explanation. But isotopes can't tell you whether someone walked to a new village or was dragged there. The chemistry looks identical either way. It's only when you lay that mobility data next to a massacre site missing its young women that the coercive explanation becomes hard to rule out. None of this would have been unfamiliar to anthropologists studying warfare in small-scale societies, still practicing it when researchers arrived to observe it. Raiding explicitly aimed at capturing women and children, sometimes called bride capture, shows up in a huge range of documented cultures. One cross-cultural survey found some version of it present in close to half of societies where marriage wasn't entirely controlled by parents on both sides. Archaeologist Catherine Cameron has built an entire research program around exactly this idea, that captives, overwhelmingly women and children, weren't incidental casualties of prehistoric conflict, but one of its central purposes, valuable enough to fight and die over, and once taken, often the very people who carried new skills, languages, and technologies into the group that took them. Then there's a stranger kind of evidence, written into DNA rather than bone. Around 5,000 years ago, a massive wave of migration swept out of the Eurasian steppe into Europe, eventually replacing most of the existing gene pool. Geneticists comparing X chromosome ancestry, which mostly travels through women, against ancestry on the rest of the genome, found the migration was dramatically skewed male. By one estimate, something like 10 migrating men for every migrating woman. Separately, geneticists studying the Y chromosome specifically found a striking global bottleneck starting around this same broad window, a small number of male lineages exploding in number, while most others simply vanished from the record, even as female genetic diversity kept expanding steadily. One leading explanation ties this directly to warfare between patrilineal clans, winning lineages wiping out or absorbing rival men while incorporating captured women. A more cautious counterargument suggests plain old social inequality among men, polygyny concentrated among the successful, could produce a similar pattern without war being the direct cause. The debate isn't settled, but either way, the shape in the DNA looks eerily like the shape already sitting in the bones. None of this stayed buried in prehistory. Rome told a founding myth about itself in which its men, short on wives, simply took the neighboring Sabine women by force and told the story proudly for centuries with no apparent shame attached.
Viking raiders ran a documented slave trade out of ports like Dublin that explicitly included captured women. Long before all of that, the shattered shins at Schöneck-Kilianstädten and the bound wrists at Nataruk suggest the practice is at least 7,000 years older than any of the history we actually wrote down.